Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're here to talk about COVID-19. As you know, all students coming to campus in the fall will be required to be vaccinated against COVID-19. All faculty and staff are currently urged to do so, and vaccination may become mandatory for them as well. I am a big believer in vaccines and the power of vaccines. Just look at the numbers. Yesterday, in all of New York State, there were only 403 positive cases. In the middle of January, our state recorded more than 15,000 cases per day. Over the past week, about 400 people have died each day on average, far too many. But in the middle of January, about 9 times as many were dying each day. All that progress is thanks to the hard work of many people and these amazingly safe and effective vaccines. I also know there are many people with legitimate questions and concerns about the vaccines, and we want to make sure that everyone has access to the best information possible. That's why we're so lucky today to have 2 experts joining us from NewYork-Presbyterian. Dr. Julia Iyasere is the executive director of the Daryle Center for Health Justice at NewYork-Presbyterian. An accomplished physician and leader, she leads efforts to address longstanding health disparities and improve health equity. On top of that, she has become a master of the Zoom webinar, and she frequently leads programs like this to talk about vaccines and community health issues. Thank you. She is joined today by her colleague, Daryle Blackstock, the Director of Clinical Transport Operations at NYP, a leading physician assistant currently pursuing a doctorate in public health. He is an avid educator and he is committed to advancing health outcomes. Thank you too. They have a short presentation and then they'll take all your questions. We are so lucky to have them join us today and we thank them for joining us. I also want to thank our trustee, Sean Smith, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief People Officer at NewYork-Pres, for making this helpful connection. Thank you, Sean. Dr. Iyasere and Mr. Blackstock, welcome to PACE. I will now turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, we will start with a very brief presentation, and then we will leave a lot of time for questions because we know that's where the most fruitful conversations happen. I do want to start off by saying that our goal here is to help support you in the decision for vaccination. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to give you the needed information so that you can be where Daryle and I were when we were vaccinated ourselves, when we sat down. And, for me, I actually was quite tearful because it was such an immense relief. And I had so much joy in the actual act of being vaccinated because I saw a light at the end of what had become a very dark tunnel for us in March of last year and through to the fall and winter of this year as well during our second surge of COVID. So we will provide a lot of information today. We'll also give you resources for additional websites and other information that you can read on your own time, just because it is a lot of information to get through. So with that, I will share my screen and we will start our quick vaccine overview. So the first question is, why should you be vaccinated? And I think this is, for everyone, it's a little bit different, but I think there are a few very simple reasons. One is to protect yourself. I mentioned my own experience with vaccination. I was one of the first to be vaccinated in December of last year. And, I think it was both a relief for myself to think about that I was now protected, but then also I thought about my mother and my family and how I could extend that protection to them as well through vaccination. But as we just heard, the numbers in New York City are much better. And that is through vaccination of the population. It's through also social distancing and masking and washing our hands, but ultimately it's through vaccination that we're going to end the pandemic. So we hear a lot about the symptoms of COVID-19. And I just want to, reground us in really what we're here to do today, which is to save people's lives through vaccination. Sometimes the numbers become so large that we can't really understand what it means anymore. I think these numbers are actually a little bit outdated and are higher now, but COVID has led to over 500,000 deaths in the United States alone. There's 500,000 people whose lives have been lost due to COVID. And so when we think about vaccination, our goal really and truly is to prevent hospitalization and death. It's to prevent severe COVID disease. It's to make sure that people are safe. And it's to really make sure this number does not continue to tick up. But I think a lot of people, we talk about the people that are hospitalized with severe COVID infection, and we sometimes don't hear about those that have the long-term effects. So those that have recovered from COVID-19 but are left with long-term issues and long-term sequelae of the initial infection. People reporting brain fog, difficulty with memory for months after infection. We know that COVID leads to lung problems because it is a respiratory disease, but additionally can lead to kidney disease and kidney problems as well, heart problems. And then we've heard a lot about blood clots, I think more recently in the news because of Johnson & Johnson, but the risk from COVID-19 and the development of blood clots is much, much, much higher. And it's actually one of the things that we are quite concerned about and worried about when people come into the hospital with COVID. So not only is COVID-19 an incredibly severe illness that has led to, as I mentioned before, a number of deaths, but it additionally can lead to long-term problems for those that even have moderate disease. So we think again about our community as well. We have recently been able to extend the vaccination to 12 to 15-year-olds with Pfizer, and I anticipate that will continue to broaden over time. But there are those that are not yet vaccinated. So under 12 years old, or those that are 12 to 15 who are not yet vaccinated. Also those that truly cannot be vaccinated, those with an allergy to the vaccine itself. So those are people that we protect through, I know you've all heard about herd immunity. We like to think of it as community immunity. So thinking about building a protective barrier around our community through vaccination. But do they work? And I think that's the big question. The answer is yes. I think hands down, resounding yes. All of the vaccines that are available in the United States work. There's Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. As was mentioned, Daryle and I have done a number of presentations, and we've changed and tweaked these slides over time. We used to talk about the numbers, like what is the percent effectiveness, and what is the 98% versus 97%. And ultimately, it didn't really matter too much, because once you're in such high numbers of effectiveness, meaning effective at preventing COVID-19 disease, those numbers didn't really mean much anymore. And I like to put it in comparison to a vaccine, which we are very comfortable with. People get the flu shot every year, and we don't even ask how effective is that flu shot. In many cases, it's less than 50% effective. I think last year it was around 49, 51% effective. All three vaccines for COVID-19, and that is Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer, are markedly more effective than our standard flu vaccine. And so when we say, do they work? Yes, absolutely they work. They all work. Are they safe? Yes. So not only have we studied these vaccines in clinical trials, and I'll talk about sort of that timeline of clinical trial a little bit later, we've studied these in tens of thousands of people in a very rigorous clinical trial setting, which means that those people, those patients in the clinical trials report every single symptom that you could even think of having during the trial phase. And they are still in the clinical trials. So we are still monitoring them over time so that we can understand how long does this immunity last? When might we need to come back for another vaccination or a booster shot? But we also now have time. And we have vaccinated, I think this number is actually 161 million people across the nation, and over 1 billion doses have been administered globally. So we have the understanding and the time to see, not only in clinical trial, what are the side effects or any adverse events, but just over time looking at the population. And knowing what we know and all of the reports of any and all adverse events, all 3 vaccines are incredibly safe. I will mention here, I know it will come up in the questions, someone will ask about Johnson & Johnson and the recent news around the blood clots. Well, I think this is actually a demonstration of how effective the system of reporting actually is in the United States. So when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was paused, there had been 6, I count 6 cases of blood clots in the country. And that was over, I think 1 million doses had been administered at that time. So if you think about how amazing our reporting system is, that we actually were able to identify 6 cases. And on that alone, they paused the rollout of vaccine so that they could understand if there was a causal link between the blood clots and the vaccine. And after a lot of, extremely smart people looking into whether or not these blood clots are related or not, they found that although it's still possible, it has not been completely identified, but it's possible that there is a relationship. However, it is extremely rare. So I think the current numbers are something that it's like 0.0, and it's 4 zeros, I'll just put it that way, 0.40 and 9% has been what we've seen of blood clots in patients who have received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. All were in majority were in younger women, so of childbearing age. So the current recommendation is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is still considered extremely safe. As I said, and I mentioned, the case or the risks of blood clots is extremely rare. And the only new recommendation that we make is that if you are 18 to 49, I believe is the age cutoff, you can be offered alternative vaccines if you choose. However, understanding that the risk of clot associated with the vaccine pales by orders of magnitude in comparison to the risk of clot associated to COVID-19 infection itself and to more common drugs that we use daily, like birth control. So how did they make them so quickly? I talked a lot about clinical trials and how safe and how robust the clinical trials are. Well, then how do we get it in 1 year? Well, first of all, we had decades of research on similar vaccines. This is not the first time that an mRNA-based vaccine, and mRNA vaccines are the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. It's also not the first time that we've trialed a vector vaccine. So Johnson & Johnson is something called an adenovirus viral vaccine. This is not our first time trying to use these or creating vaccines this way. So there's decades of research that went into both the platform for Moderna and Pfizer, as well as the platform for Johnson & Johnson. And I'll take you through how this comes to be in 1 year. But I think just a very important point to highlight is that all of the same safety standards that you have to meet for clinical trials in the United States were still met through all of the trials, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. So this is a traditional timeline. Research is many years, and I will tell you that the research that went into the mRNA-based vaccines started in the late 90s. So we hear about them as if they are brand new. No, they're actually not brand new. If they had really been brand new, we never would be able to use them in 1 year. It took decades before people could stabilize that little piece of mRNA and use it in the way that it is used. So we had years of research to sort of really build the platform for the vaccines that we have. And then we overlapped the testing phases. So I mentioned that clinical trials are quite robust. They take a long time. And so the decision was made to overlap the trial phases so that we could do them more quickly. However, it was understood that if there were any concerns at any step of the way, the entire trial was paused while it was investigated. And this didn't really happen to the vaccines that we are currently using, although it did happen to the AstraZeneca vaccine. That trial was paused exactly because this is exactly how it should work. The trial was paused, there were an adverse event that was investigated, and then the trial was restarted. And it's actually probably one of the reasons I think that the AstraZeneca vaccine is still a little bit delayed, is because they did have that short pause during the original clinical trial. But it highlights exactly that the system works, that we had a clinical trial strategy to allow safety to be number one, but to also allow us to get these vaccines to market as quickly as we could. Another decision that was made very early on was the decision to start producing, to manufacture the vaccines before the clinical trials were finished. And I think I remember when Tony Fauci got up in front of Congress and said, we'd rather lose money than lose lives. So if we make these vaccines and they don't work, we throw them away. But I'd rather have them in stock waiting for when we can use them. And if you notice, in the United States, we actually do have a fair number of AstraZeneca doses. We're not using them because of exactly this. We produced them waiting to make sure that they were safe. We still have AstraZeneca. It may be available in the future. I don't know, but it's exactly to highlight this system and strategy of producing them so that they're ready for if and when they are ready to be used. And then the last thing is that when you think about the government, and I am not casting any no political beliefs here to talk about, only to say that when you have a large agency, if it's the US government or any other agency, there is a lot of red tape just associated with setting up meetings, getting people to comment on things, getting data from one place to another, getting a review. And all of that really melts away in the midst of a pandemic, when everyone's eyes are turned to one thing and you have one goal. There is no email that goes unanswered. There is no meeting that you miss. Everyone is targeted and laser focused to get one thing done. So when you build all of that together, you take a timeline that can take 5-6 years, and you're really able to put it down into 1 year, which is how we got these vaccines so quickly. However, it means that no safety standards were skipped. All the same processes were followed. There was just a very clear strategy of engagement at the very beginning. So we have these vaccines, but what about these new variants? Do I have to worry about them? Well, as viruses spread, they mutate. Mutations are just small changes that the virus over time develops. And you have seen across the country and across the globe, new variants popping up. There's a new variant in India. There's been new variants in the United States. And the concern with these new variants is that it gives the virus a chance to get better, meaning that the virus can infect people more. It can make you sicker, or it can start to evade the vaccine. We're very lucky right now that they've tested all of our vaccines that are available, and they still do confer protection against the variants that we have. But one of our major concerns is that if we allow coronavirus time to continue to mutate, then these new variants will become a reason to have to use another vaccine. And this is, I know the question is going to come up. Do we need boosters, or do we need an annual vaccine? The answer to that is complicated. We're not sure. We know that the immunity from the vaccine I got from Pfizer months and months ago, or from Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, we know that immunity is excellent. And they're still testing to see how long it lasts. I've seen people say, it's a minimum of 6 months. We know that for a fact. Probably up to a year, maybe even longer. But the concern actually is around the variants. As you start to create new variants of the virus, you may have to modify the vaccine slightly and give a booster shot to cover something that's new that the original vaccine doesn't cover anymore. But this isn't something new. This is what we do with the flu shot every year. Every year, scientists get together and they look and they say, what do we think is going to be the dominant variant this year? And that's how they make the flu vaccine. So if the question comes up in the chat, which I haven't checked yet, boosters, we're not sure, but it's probably going to be driven by the variants that we see in the community. The faster we can vaccinate people, the less risk we have of more and more variants being developed, and the longer that we think the immunity will last. So will this vaccine hurt your community? Absolutely not. A diverse community came together to make these vaccines. The trials were conducted in diverse populations, both ethnically diverse, racially diverse, as well as people with many different medical conditions. So lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, because we wanted to make sure that the trials reflected the people that would be getting the vaccines. So they needed to reflect the people that live in the United States, and they did. So we know that many communities have suffered greatly from COVID-19. And through vaccination, we actually can protect our communities so that we stop much of this suffering. So who can get the vaccine? Well, right now, as I mentioned earlier, anyone 12 and above is eligible for vaccine. The only real criteria is from 12 to 15. It's the Pfizer vaccine that is currently available. I suspect, although I'm not 100% sure, I suspect that Moderna will be able to be offered in younger ages at some point, but right now it's Pfizer for 12 to 15, and then Moderna 18 and above, as well as Johnson & Johnson is 18 and above. Question we get asked is about where and when, and there are a lot of now places where you can access the vaccine, and they all are free. So there's no cost to the vaccine. This is a federal vaccine, so you are getting it free of charge from the US government. So it's going to take a lot of time to vaccinate everyone, and we know that. We are, I think, about at 50% or so of the US has either one dose of vaccine, but the goal is really for us to get to if you were talking about community immunity, that number is somewhere around 80% of the population that needs to be vaccinated. And that 80% includes the people I talked about who can't be vaccinated yet. So it includes people who are too young. It includes people who are allergic to the vaccine and will never be able to be vaccinated with the current vaccines we have. So 80% is a high number. We're slowly getting there, but we need everyone to take part in this. So in the meantime, we got to keep wearing masks. Even if you're vaccinated, the CDC has strict recommendations about when you can take your mask off. Washing our hands is a no-brainer. We always need to wash our hands for COVID-19 or not. And then we continue to maintain our distance. For those that have been fully vaccinated, some of these requirements around mask wearing have been relaxed. But for those that are unvaccinated, the requirements are still very much in place. So we know that there are a lot of questions. I can see the chat pinging away with questions. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll get to some of your questions. If you don't ask everything that I think we've been asked before, some of the basic ones, we may just throw in a few answers and here and there just to round out the conversation.
Julia, I've been scanning the chat, and wonderful, wonderful questions. I'm going to give you a minute to catch your breath, but I think
go ahead, Daryle.
No, well, there's a theme, and I actually want to pose this to you to continue along the vein of what you were talking about. You had a slide up that looked at how we condensed, or at least the makers of the vaccine condensed that clinical trial. And so there's a few questions here talking about, well, and you did talk about the fact that this isn't a long-term trial and that we need more work. One of the questions said, well, what are the long-term, effects of the vaccine? Do we know what's going to happen in 10, 20, and 30 years? And I think you started to touch on that. So I just wanted to know if you could just elaborate on that just a little bit more for us.
Absolutely. So One of the things that I think we're very lucky is that we've used vaccines for decades. So, I mean, we're all very familiar with the flu vaccine, but I'm sure many of you have had measles, mumps, and rubella. We have hepatitis vaccines. We have, in other countries that have Ebola and Zika. There are many, many different vaccines. And so we have the privilege of seeing over time, do we expect long-term side effects from vaccination? And the general consensus in the scientific community is that most of the effects, the side effects or adverse effects that you get from vaccines are actually short-term. So that's within that 4 to 8 week window, which was included in the clinical trials. So that's why a lot of people felt very comfortable right as the clinical trials ended. Like I myself, Daryle, we were vaccinated very early on without now almost a year of data looking at any and all of side effects in globally now, actually, not just in the United States. So I think it's important to realize that we understand how the vaccines work, and that helps us to understand what should we expect. And we really expect if you're going to have any effects or side effects or adverse events, those are really short term in that 2 to 8 week or 4 to 8 week window. And I think also, I didn't really mention this too much, but I guess I should take a slight moment to say the 3 vaccines that are available, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, we really say that whichever vaccine is available to you is the best vaccine. I myself was Pfizer, my sister's a physician, she was Pfizer, her husband's a physician, Moderna, my mother, Johnson & Johnson, my partner's mother received AstraZeneca. So really, and someone yesterday said we are emblematic of vaccine diversity. And we are, because I think it's important to realize that all of them work very well. But just to highlight a little bit of the difference very quickly. So Moderna and Pfizer are something called mRNA-based vaccines. Johnson & Johnson, as I mentioned, is an adenoviral vector vaccine. So what does that even mean? Well, in both cases, all 3 vaccines follow a very similar strategy. Tell your body to make a protein that looks like coronavirus to stimulate immunity. They do it in slightly different ways. So Moderna and Pfizer give a little piece of mRNA, and that mRNA is the message, make the protein. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, uses a cold virus that can't cause your cold anymore. I mean, the common cold can't cause a cold anymore. And again, gives a piece of information. This time it's a little piece of DNA, which then it again uses your body to say, make that into mRNA, same thing that the Moderna and Pfizer do, and says, make a protein. So we're using your own body system to say, create an immune response. And then once you have that immune response, that's all you're left with. The other pieces of the vaccine do not last very long. So that's also why we don't expect long-term effects, because the only thing that really lasts long-term are the antibodies. The rest of it really deteriorates, sometimes within a day, sometimes within a week, but doesn't really last for years. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, so let me just, and I'll address a few of the questions here, Julian. Thank you so much. I mean, I always learn. We've done quite a bit of these panels, and I always learn. I'm always engaged in everything that you share. So there are some other questions that came up, and they were asking about, a 13-year-old who had COVID in the past and their family had COVID. And, you were properly advised that if the child had antibodies, do you have to rush and get that child vaccinated? And the answer is no. But what we do know is that, folks who had COVID may have had antibodies, or they may have gone away a lot sooner than expected. So it is encouraged that, everyone get the vaccine, right? So yes, so at an appropriate time, she should be vaccinated. She's 13, and as Julia mentioned, they're eligible for the Pfizer vaccine. There was another question that came up about, does the World Health Organization approve these vaccines? So they do have a list. They have a list of vaccines that they've approved based on their scientific research. However, here in the United States, we have the FDA that regulates all drugs that comes through the United States. And so we have FDA approved vaccine. So that's who we're looking at. And then let me address the rheumatoid. I'm giving you a chance here, Julie. There's tons of great questions there. So I'm going to take this all the way up to, I know you're looking at this chat. I'm going to take this all the way up to how does the COVID vaccine work and can it still be passed on? So you can, they're great questions. Thank you. This is wonderful. So let's talk about rheumatoid arthritis. Someone asked, I have rheumatoid arthritis. Should I take the COVID vaccine? So yes, I'll tell you that the associations for rheumatoid arthritis or any autoimmune disease where your body develops antibodies towards its own cells, and this one happens to be the lining of the joints, and you develop the antibodies in the joints and they swell, and that's what causes that pain. So that's rheumatoid arthritis. It's an autoimmune disease. So yes, it's recommended that you do get the vaccine. The concern that others had is, well, I'm taking medications to prevent this autoimmune disorder. How will that affect the vaccine? Now, I work in the area of transplant where we give similar drugs to prevent the body from rejecting an organ, right? And prevent from developing those antibodies. We're still giving the vaccines and we're doing studies now to see exactly how it works. And what we're showing is that patients who take these medications similar to rheumatoid arthritis medications will need a little bit more of the vaccine, but we are recommending that you do take the vaccine, as well as those national organizations for rheumatoid arthritis. And then there was another great question. These are wonderful questions talking about the COVID vaccine and how does it work. Well, if I take the vaccine, people are saying that I can still get COVID. And yes, that is what we know to be true. Remember, and I'm just going to show you this is my hand. This is your virus. And then you have crowns on the virus. And that's why it's called coronavirus, right? It's a crown. And on the picture that Julia showed towards the end of her slide, these vaccines are really attacking those spikes, because those spikes are what really invades the cell and allows that coronavirus to pass information into your host cells and then recreate and cause all this damage. So what you're doing is preventing that crown portion of the virus from being so effective. So yes, it is possible that you could still get COVID-19 and you can pass it on. The goal of the vaccines is to make sure that you're not, or to try to allow you not to be as sick, to prevent the number of patients that we saw going into the ICUs and into our step-down units needing to be intubated, the severity of COVID-19. The goal is to reduce that severity and reduce hospital admissions, and that's what we saw. That's what President Krislov spoke about. That's what Dr. Iyasere spoke about, is that we're seeing a reduction in the severity of the disease. And so some, you're rightfully saying, hey, we don't know the long-term effects of this vaccine, and I'm concerned. And yes, I can tell you that as I sat there to get my shot, and as Dr. Iyasere said, as she was sitting there to get her shot, my family members as well, there's some nervousness that goes with this, right? And we're not saying that you have to get this, but we're giving you the right information. And what I can tell you is that what we saw in the hospital from patients suffering from COVID-19 is something that we've never seen or experienced before. And we're all affected by it as medical providers. And we know what can happen with COVID-19. We know what's happening with the vaccine now, and we're letting you know that the risk versus the benefit of the vaccine, the benefits of the vaccine way outweigh the risk. Julie, I think I gave you enough time to catch your breath there. You're on mute. So just unmute and then jump in.
Yeah, I'm back. I think there's been a couple of questions about allergies that have come up. And I think that, it's important for you to understand what type of allergy you have. So food allergies and systemic allergies to drugs, like, to aspirin or Tylenol or any drugs, either by mouth or injected, are allergies that you should tell the person that is giving you the vaccine about. They are not contraindications to being vaccinated. I myself have a fair number of very severe food allergies, but it's important to tell the person giving you the vaccine. And what we do is we recommend a longer time to watch you after you've been vaccinated. So it's standard that everyone who receives any vaccine is watched for 15 minutes. We then extend that to 30 minutes if you have a history of severe food allergies or allergies to other drugs. That is different though if you have an allergy to a component of the vaccine. And I'll recommend that if you're unsure, there's on one of our websites, or you can go to the CDC website and look at the manufacturer of what's actually in the vaccine. It's a very short list, but allergies to a component of the vaccine are contraindications to vaccination, which makes sense. If you're allergic to a piece of the vaccine, we shouldn't give it to you. But if you are allergic to foods, or if you have, sort of seasonal allergies, other things, they are not contraindications to vaccination. We just let the person who's vaccinating you know. And then that's actually what when I was first vaccinated, you wait for half an hour and they watch you to make sure you don't have any side effects. So I think there were a couple of other questions about, and I think there's one question here about if you can kind of mix the manufacturers. They're actually studying that right now to see what happens if and this doesn't relate to Johnson & Johnson because that's a single dose, but for Moderna and Pfizer, there have been a fair number of people who got Pfizer or Moderna as their first shot and then unfortunately got the wrong manufacturer as the second dose. So they're doing some studies right now to see what effect does that have. But we always recommend, yes, you should get, if you first were dosed with Moderna, you should get Moderna as the second dose. If you got Pfizer, you should get Pfizer as the second dose. And if you bring your card should have on it what was the manufacturer. And that should be, you should always get that same manufacturer. And that's important just because the clinical trials were done with that same manufacturer and the same dose. So the doses of Moderna and Pfizer, the actual sort of milligram doses are slightly different. So it's important to stay with that same manufacturer that you've gotten before. And then I think there was another question about natural immunity versus immunity driven by the vaccines. And I know, Daryle, you talked about this a little bit. I'll just say again that we don't know how long the natural immunity lasts. And we actually don't know how good it is. We've seen people be reinfected with coronavirus after they've had an initial infection. We think that's probably driven by variants, but it's not entirely clear yet. But we've also seen colleagues who have had coronavirus infection and are tested for antibodies and they're negative. There is a question, I think there was a first question about whether or not you should test for antibodies after vaccination. I know, Daryle, you mentioned one earlier, but I'll just put it out there that the reason we do not recommend antibody testing after vaccination is because you really have to know exactly what antibody test you have. And it has to be the right test for the right antibody. So that's not recommended, just routine testing for antibodies after vaccination. I answered that one.
I wanted to just jump in. I know as in scanning the room, there are a lot of PACE student and employee specific questions. Please know that we're not ignoring you, but they will be answered after this session. The full panel is here, and I did see some websites and where you can go to get answers. So those specific questions regarding the policies at PACE will be answered. So just to let you know, we're not ignoring that. There was a question about fertility and the vaccine, and I can say, and I'm just going to start, and we're going to tag team this, but a lot of the OBGYN, at least the obstetric communities, they actually endorse the vaccine, especially for pregnancy age. We do know that in Black, Brown, and marginalized communities, we have a high risk of, maternal morbidity, meaning that women who are giving birth or who are pregnant and giving birth, they suffer a high rate of morbidity. And COVID, we know, caused a lot of complications. So the thought process here is to be vaccinated, protected against the vaccine as much as possible to reduce the risk of death. We did, and Julia, I'll tap you to talk about the fertility portion of this. What are your thoughts on fertility and the vaccine? Does it cause fertility issues?
No, there's been no link at all between any of the vaccines and any effect on fertility. And I'll actually go just to talk a little bit more about pregnancy in itself, because that's its own category. And I know there's been a lot of conversation. I know Daryle just mentioned that many of the governing bodies actually do endorse vaccination. Many of the like American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists. But there was actually a recent study that just came out that looked at the effect of mRNA vaccines on the placenta to see whether or not, as the placenta is that conduit between mother and baby, the original concern was that because of the way that the immunity against COVID was generated, it could have effects on the placenta. So they did that study to look and see if there's inflammation, if there's changes in the way that the arteries are structured in the placenta. And they actually saw absolutely no changes. So and that study was actually, I think, just came out last week. It was quite recent to look at the effects, if there were any, on mRNA-based vaccines on the placenta, and it showed that there were not any. The other thing is that, we have seen there's a registry now of women who have been vaccinated, pregnant women who have been vaccinated over the last year. And so I think that number is around 35,000 so far, maybe a little bit higher than that, of pregnant women that have been vaccinated that have registered to say that they received the vaccine. And we've seen no adverse events in those populations. They are still under study, like we still do need to do dedicated trials with pregnant women because they were not included in the original clinical trials. But the sort of observational data that we have so far has all been very positive, and has shown, to date, no adverse events in pregnant people. So I think that's one of is reassuring to people. And I think also, understanding how the vaccines work is also quite important because it helps us understand what are the potential risks from them. One of the other questions about Johnson & Johnson, as I said, it's an adenoviral vector-based vaccine. That vaccine is that type of vaccine has been used before and has been used in a number of pregnant people before. So we had other data to look at to make some general recommendations. As I said, because pregnant women were not included, to be fair, there were a number of women who became pregnant in the clinical trials just because that's how life works. But because there was not a dedicated study including pregnant women, that's why we don't generally give blanket, the CDC does not give blanket recommendations about pregnancy. We say that, we recommend that you talk to your OB-GYN, but we know that the effects of COVID-19 can be, extremely severe and are heightened in pregnancy. So, it is really a conversation that we advise people to have.
Julia, I'm going to take the next few questions, but in all fairness, I'm not really being fair here. I'm setting you up because there's some frustration with regards to information that we're sharing versus what they're getting from manufacturers. So I want you just to wet your whistle a little bit and we'll talk about, where do we get this information from and why is it that the manufacturers? So let me take the next few and give you some time to get that going in all fairness. See, I have to work with Julia, everybody, and I see her way too often to set her up. So it's, it's give and take here. So, someone said that the Pfizer vaccine was shown, I believe this was in Israel based on a comment, that it was shown to cause some myocarditis in young men after the Pfizer vaccine. Well, I'll tell you that COVID-19 itself causes inflammation and irreversible scarring. And we know of many organs, including the lungs and the heart. And we're seeing this heart tissue scarring in very young people who had mild cases of COVID-19. And what we're concerned about is heart failure in the future. So again, it's risk versus benefits. Myocarditis that's caught, that's reversible versus this irreversible scarring caused by the virus. So that's the information there. Someone asking, now you're in my alley of public health, right? I'm in environmental occupational. I see some questions here about, should I wear the mask? And I can combine that with if the virus is airborne, why are we concerned about washing our hands, right? So we know that this COVID-19 virus is airborne, it stays in the air, but then it also settles on surfaces. And we all have this very great, I'm going to show you this posture. We have this great comfortable posture. I think we were probably in our mom's womb, it was just comfortable. But what we do, we touch surfaces and we bring those viruses on our hands, and then we bring it to our T-zone, our eyes, nose, and mouth. And that's how we'll help to bring the virus from surfaces in. So that's why we recommend frequent hand hygiene to get that virus off, wearing a mask to help prevent some of the big particulates from going in, and then also remind you not to do this to touch your face, to do that surface. So all of these things in combination work. Now, if you're vaccinated, do you take your masks off? So of course we've seen the CDC come out with many, updates. And Julia, you can start then, and we'll get into the frustration part. But the CDC has said, listen, yes, if you're outside, is it safe that you can walk outside in a public area without your mask? They said yes. And if you're in your own pod, your family members who've all been vaccinated, and you know that it's a controlled environment, they're saying yes. Julia, I'll be honest with you, if I'm out and about, I'm going to wear my mask. I'm still going to practice that social distancing because I know that's effective. Julia, what do you think?
I actually agree. I gave a talk yesterday where we were discussing masking, and someone asked me, well, why should I really be vaccinated if I can't take my mask off? And I wasn't trying, I'm really being honest with my answer, which is that the goal of vaccination is to save your life. The goal of vaccination is to keep you out of the hospital. The goal of vaccination is to ultimately try to prevent people from getting COVID-19. And I think of it as, really icing on the cake to take the mask off. I think that that's, when we are in a place where we've vaccinated enough people that circulating coronavirus is low enough, then we can start to really get back to normal. And I think we've seen, as you mentioned, Daryle, that the CDC has been relaxing the policies for those that are fully vaccinated, which means 2 weeks after your second dose of Moderna and Pfizer, or 2 weeks after your only dose of Johnson & Johnson. So for me, I just looked again, and I think they updated that if you're fully vaccinated, you can go to like an indoor workout class with your mask off. I'll be honest, I don't do that. I still wear my mask if I'm going indoors with a lot of people, because I don't really know their vaccination status, and it's not my responsibility, and it's not my business to ask people. So I think it's definitely a personal decision. I've seen recently Starbucks has allowed people to come in if they are fully vaccinated without a mask on. But I can tell you that I still wear my mask when I'm walking in and out of, settings with a lot of people. I, of course, wear my mask on the train. When I'm at home with my family members who are all vaccinated, I take my mask off. When I'm with members of my close-knit family and household community that have all been vaccinated, I take my mask off. If I'm walking outside and I am, walking down the street, I'm outdoors and I take my mask off. So I think that there are places that are very safe for people that have been vaccinated to take their mask off, and even those that are unvaccinated to be unmasked. But I think in general, I'm still rather cautious about being unmasked. Go ahead.
I as promised, there's some tough questions here in the room, right, in the chat group, and there's some frustration.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think that really understanding, because there's a question about a component of the Moderna vaccine, which says, well, what is this? And I think that the question was specifically about, I think it's SM-103, which is actually a lipid. And so a lipid is so you can think of it as like a fat particle, and it's how the vaccine was suspended to be able to deliver that into the system. So, I think when you look scientifically at the back end of what are these individual components, you have to do a little bit of digging to understand scientifically what they all mean. I think one of the other things that people see frequently, and we've been mentioning in a couple of other discussions around allergies, is allergies to polyethylene glycol. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of people know what that actually is or what it means. For Daryle and myself, we've heard of that for years. I mean, I know I was very familiar with what that was and what it could be contained in. But for other people that aren't necessarily as familiar with the language, it can be quite frustrating for people to say, well, it's either a number or it's a letter, and we're not really sure what that means. So then I do recommend that it's really important that people talk to either their personal providers or people they trust to get more information about what what actually is components of the vaccine, what their concerns are about the vaccines. We can give you a link to all of our information at the hospital, which has been reviewed by many of our infection prevention and control specialists, some of whom who have they are vaccine specialists and been doing work in vaccines for decades. We also do have the benefit of having hosted part of the clinical trials at some of our campuses, of being, of knowing people. I know doctors who were in the clinical trials. And so really getting some of that behind the scenes and understanding what the safety protocols were and what the safety profiles were, I think definitely it can be a challenge because there's so much information coming out there that you really have to be able to say, well, what's true and what's not true. I had a question the other day, which I think was a really good one, because I want to just throw it in now because I think we probably have time for just 2 more questions. It's sort of going along the lines of some of the frustration, and I hope that the answer I gave was somewhat helpful to someone. So the question was, well, why can't I get my vaccine from my doctor? Like, I just want to go to, it's not fair that it's been either at these large sites or now it's being slightly decentralized, but it's still not available everywhere. And that, I think that can be a source of frustration for people. And I just want to, first of all, I think it's, in some ways, it's almost a good problem to have, because we are in such a different place than we were last December. So in December, when we started rolling out the vaccines, we didn't know one day versus the next how many doses people were going to get. You found out like 48 hours in advance if you were going to get X number of batches of vaccines. And so in the beginning, it was really important that those vaccines went to large settings that could really get in a lot of people. So first with healthcare providers, and really making sure that you were using all of it. So I'll also just remind you that you may not be aware of this, but in the beginning, Pfizer and Moderna had very strict requirements for being very cold for a very long time, and you could only open the refrigerator twice, and then you had to waste batches of vaccine. It had to be kept at a specifically cold temperature, and once it thawed, you had to use all of the doses in the vial. And so it was really, again, we were sort of leveraging large healthcare systems that could mass vaccinate, really could afford to have these deep freezers and make sure that we didn't waste any vaccine. Well, now we're in a much different time. They've been restudying the vaccines, looking at their stability at sort of closer to room temperature. How long can we use them at closer to room temperature? And so now I think you're seeing an expansion of the availability of vaccine because of that. Also, Johnson & Johnson came online, which had different requirements. And so I think because we are really, 6 months, 7 months into our vaccine rollout across the country, we now have a lot more flexibility. And I anticipate in 6 more months, this will be that it's at your personal physician. It is at the, it's already at CVS and many urgent cares. I think over time, it will become easier to access.
I think, just for everyone, and thank you all for attending, and these questions were absolutely phenomenal. And I see the hesitancy, and people are debating, and people may not necessarily choose to get the vaccine. And that's that for those who are really saying that I'm not comfortable with this, it's your right not to be comfortable and to seek out the answers. Our purpose for today is just to make sure that you had the most up-to-date information, right? From our perspective, from our areas of clinical practice and study. We're not here saying that you have to, that Dr. Iyasere and Daryle Blackstock saying that you have to, do this. We're not forcing you to do this. We're sharing with you information and answering your questions, right? Now, there's a mandate that's, by PACE. PACE will, the administrators will definitely address your concerns. They do have some exceptions. Again, they will address those concerns. So feel free to reach out. They'll reach out to you. The information is there. But please, just to be clear, we're here to give you the information, because not only is access to the vaccine important, access to the right, most up-to-date information from our clinical expertise is also equally important. So, with that, I'm not sure if there are any other questions that we can get to. I think there are a lot of, recurring themes, but I would just like to thank you, for joining us on this I think was a very informative. The questions were robust, and I thoroughly actually enjoyed answering the questions. I don't want to speak for Dr. Iyasere, but I can see by the smile, but I'll let her speak for herself.
I just want to say thank you all for joining us today, for bringing all of your questions. I think there's a wealth of information out there, and we'll be sure to share, our website, which links directly to the CDC, which is really where all of us get our information. So if you ever have any questions, if there are any concerns, if you're not sure about the data that you're reading or you're seeing, you really should just go back to the CDC's website. It has a wealth of really excellent information there. And it's really, we try to stay in line with the CDC, because a lot of the materials that they produce, as I said, have been put together by some of our greatest scientific minds. And they're really thinking about what is safe, what is appropriate, and how can we really save the most people. So thanks for your time today. I'm sure there are a number of other questions that we just can't get to, but hopefully, we'll, as I said, send some other information, and which includes frequently asked questions. So you can follow up there for other information. Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.